Thank you for staying with us. Let's move along to this story. Now, the 30th annual high-profile mining Indaba, recently held in Cape Town, has been grappling with socio-economic issues facing the mining industry, ranging from a fall in exports and load shedding to rail and port crisis. Mineral Resources Minister Gwede Mantashe said 2023 was a tough year for Africa's mining industry due to a myriad of factors. Now, to help us unpack this further, we're joined by Mohammed Ali, Managing Director of ISO Specialist Worldwide Industrial and Systems Engineers. Mohammed, thank you so much for joining us at News at Prime. Lots coming out of the mining Indaba. What would you say some of the main challenges or obstacles are that mining companies may encounter when implementing energy management standards, and how can they overcome these challenges?
Evening, Masa, and evening to South Africa. Yeah, I think there's a lot of challenges with the power shortage that we have currently in South Africa and all the constraints that are coming with load shedding. I think shareholder confidence associated with production and downtime are the key concerns. Now, whilst implementing energy management systems, it's important to understand that a system or a new standard that comes in comes with change. And a lot of people are susceptible to change. They're not really comfortable. They don't really understand it. And a lot has to do with the behavioral elements of implementing these particular policies, processes, and procedures. A simple example is if you were brought up at home with a culture of switching off the light, when you go to work, that's exactly the same behavior you'll bring in. And now when that behavior doesn't come in, you have to now implement controls like perhaps putting a poster to say switch off the light. And if that doesn't work, you have to put capital investment to put in sensor lighting. And I think that capital investment is one of the big challenges right now that mining organizations are looking to invest in to get a longer return, something that they did not budget for when it came to actually load shedding. However, I do feel that if you implement these international standards, in the short term it might look like a heap of a capital investment, but in the long term I definitely feel that there's value to be seen in terms of a return on investments.
And, you know, the behavioral change that you speak of, as we know, with change like that, particularly with behavior, it does take some time. Now, staying with load shedding, how significant is the impact of load shedding on mining operations? You know, you're speaking of this capital as well, but according to Stats SA, if we're looking at those figures, mining output slowed by 2%. When we're looking at the period of September 2023, when you compare it to the previous year. Now, it's clearly having a huge impact. I mean, that 2% in itself, when we look at not just the mining, the load shedding problem in mining, but also the rail problem and the port problem in mining, all that coming together to a loss of about 150 billion rand in just a year.
Yeah, I think what everyone needs to understand that a lot of the mining organizations are based on your market share price and shareholder confidence. So people invest in these mining houses to be able to ensure that there's a certain forecast put out in terms of the production output they need to deliver. Now, when it comes to load shedding as well as unplanned load shedding, that it affects the mining output and the production, and that reduces the confidence of these shareholders. And that's when investments start pulling out, which puts a huge strain on the workforce. And that's where, unfortunately, we need to cut costs. We're cutting costs, that's where people's jobs get affected. Now, what organizations like big mining houses have done is they've started investing money in alternative energy, and that's perhaps putting up a solar or a wind farm to be able to compensate for these challenges in terms of what is causing, what's being caused in South Africa, is to still keep that shareholder confidence and keep the money flowing in so that we are able to drill and be able to produce the gold. But like you said, it's not just the mining industry, it's everything surrounding it that also has an effect in terms of rail, in terms of transport, in terms of the delays when it comes to load shedding. A simple thing like traffic lights going off and things like scheduling, or in terms of what time your particular load needs to go out, all of those have a huge impact. And I think that's been the biggest concern right now, where perhaps you don't see it as much, but 2% at 1.5 billion is a huge loss to the GDP of this particular country.
Certainly. And Mohammed, I'd like to quote you. You wrote that mining operations cannot be reliant on Eskom's supply of power alone and scheduled downtime. I guess this is you talking about those organizations being able to get alternative energy sources, but that's also coming at a cost to business as well.
Yeah, and I think that's where companies, so when you're implementing these energy management systems or ISO 50001, they are focused on determining your significant energy usage. What that basically means is what asset is consuming the most amount of energy. So if you look at it from a simplistic point of view, if you have a smart meter installed in your household, it generally tells you on a day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month basis whether or not your air conditioning units are consuming the most amount of energy from a kilowatt-hour perspective. And you can then obviously put that into rands and cents and determine what asset is consuming the most amount of energy. Now, in the mining industry, that's exactly what's happening, is that they're trying to analyze and understand what assets are consuming the most amount of energy. In their particular plant, they've got different types of instruments or different types of drilling machines or grinding machines or crushing machines that takes a lot of energy out. Now, when these constraints come in, you need to then look at alternative, because you can't rely on Eskom. Now, generators, yes, it's all great and well, you can have generators, but there's a fuel supply. Now, obviously, the cost on diesel, there's the planning of getting the diesel across. There's environmental concerns in terms of diesel spillage. So a lot of companies are now investing in alternative energy, and that's the cost, the unseen cost that's hindering the price of gold or the price of platinum. Note that all mining companies work in an all-in cost. So if your all-in cost is low, then there's generally decent profit, and the shareholders tend to buy in. But once your all-in cost goes higher because of alternative energy projects, the profit margins reduce, and then shareholders become very nervous to want to consider doing work or investing in these particular mining operations.
No, and you know, it was just this week that we had a fuel price hike as well, which will obviously also have a detrimental impact on those companies who are using alternative energy to keep their lights on as well. Ultimately speaking, whether it doesn't look like this energy crisis will be solved anytime soon, does this mean that there will be a decline in operations at mining companies?
It's a difficult thing. So mining organizations cannot compromise their production. So they've taken it where they've been able to invest as much as possible and shift budget where maybe budget may have been required to either improve on infrastructure or improve on the technology side of mining, where they've now had to shift and deviate that particular planning and budget into alternative energy by building solar farms. And they're trying to get that to compensate for the shareholder confidence. Now, I don't think, in my opinion, that the mining houses will compromise their production, but what I do think is it will hinder the price of gold and also the shareholder confidence from international investors, because they look at South Africa generally being the New York of Africa, and if we cannot control our power, which they feel is a basic necessity to be able to survive, it creates a lot of doubt. And I think that doubt and concern is what we should be more concerned with. I do think the mining houses will come out. I know they have invested a lot in terms of different types of alternative energy. And I do think there will be a scale where job shortages will encounter. It will be a very difficult time in South Africa. As you did say, the fuel prices have gone up. But I do think we can come out of this, provided that we follow decent standards and important elements of contractor management, as well as decent engineering principles in terms of looking at the data and making informative decisions.
Now, you know, energy is not the only problem that the industry faces as well. Of course, we know of a severe decline in infrastructure stability as well as the woes at Transnet, which we've touched on earlier. Now, how are these infrastructure and issues at transport, within transport for rail and the ports, exacerbating the power crisis and, in fact, the entire crisis that the mining industry faces, not just only on a power perspective?
So I generally boil it down to three things. I think the first one is in terms of being able to have correct planning on a maintenance perspective, from a maintenance side. The second is correct procurement processes from a vendor management perspective. And the third is having insufficient or incorrect standards in place. So what generally happens is buildings get neglected. we are generally hesitant to invest in maintenance. If you have a vehicle, you do know how important it is that when that vehicle hits a certain kilometers or threshold, you need to take it for service, and that's generally to prevent your particular vehicle from breaking down. And all buildings, all infrastructures work in the same way, where you need to go through building compliance orders to look at the structural integrity of the building. You need to ensure that the air quality, the water quality, the ergonomics, the particular structural requirements are all done. Now that comes at a cost. And unfortunately, since nothing's wrong with the building, we don't put money into that cost. And then when we do go through the procurement process, unfortunately nowadays you can go on LinkedIn and put up a job and get someone's CV and showcase that you have the expertise to do the work. But meanwhile, when you get the contract work, you don't send that engineer, you get someone else to do it. And now you're getting inferior skills, quality, performing the task because we don't have correct vendor management in place. And the people reviewing the work that's required to be done, they perhaps may not be skilled and competent. And now that puts a huge risk in terms of the integrity of the report or the particular maintenance that's being done at a fraction of a cost, when unfortunately it should have been done in the right cost, with the right skills, with the right expertise, with the right particular accountability being taken. And if there's no consequence management for the entire process, unfortunately these particular disasters are continuously going to occur in our country.
Now, just going back to the safety standards that you're speaking of now, particularly when it comes to infrastructure as well, safety standards and health standards in the mining sector for years now have not been so great when it comes to mine workers and injuries. Now, when we are having deteriorating infrastructure as well, I'm presuming that will only make it worse. How is the industry going to be able to make sure that they reduce the risk of workplace injuries?
I think it goes back to our discussion we started. I think it's all about the culture and the behavior the organization sets. If from the top you take health and safety to be a priority in your organization, where you say you will not mine or do any sort of construction work until it is safe, and you have the controls that these international standards promulgate in terms of doing a risk-based approach methodology where you assess the work to be done, assess the risks, make sure the right controls are being put in place to safeguard the particular activity and the human interaction with that activity, these will perhaps help with us. And now it's always been the priority where a lot of production managers feel that this is taking away vital time from their production schedule. So they like to bypass policies and procedures in order to be able to meet the targets. And we start compromising the rules. Once you start compromising the rules and create that culture in your organization, it is felt it is okay to do it because my superior has allowed me to do this on concession. And that's when your safety standards drop. Now that is a huge problem, because not only are we reducing the confidence of our shareholders, but we are also reluctantly now we are convincing our employees that we're not allowing them a safe working environment. Now they're hesitant to do work. Employees are insecure. Employees don't feel secure working in an environment where there are shortcuts being taken, because do they know they're going to be able to go back home? And with the deteriorating infrastructure that's not being maintained adequately, these are all the challenges we're facing. And if we don't go back to the basics of looking at what these standards say and following it to the T, and auditors being able to hold top management accountable for their respective actions, I don't think we're going to progress. I think we're only going to regress.
Yeah, and who can blame those mine workers for feeling insecure about that health and safety? Thank you so much for joining us at News at Prime. We appreciate your time and your insights.